Uhuru, Uhuru Sasa. We are you're listening to Diasporic music, and we have just completed the Jazz Zone. The Providence did a stellar show per usual, and we are getting ready to interview Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is the author of about 50 books, and he is the John and J. Rebecca Moore's chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and his latest work is the capital of slavery. And in this work by Dr. Horne, it refers to Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865. And how are you doing today, Dr. Horne?
It's all good.
I guess, Melinda, you want to kick it off, and what are we going to deal with at first?
Well, I don't. We have a lot on the list. I don't know where you want to start. Do you want to start with Nikki Minaj?
Sure. Well,
go ahead.
You know,
go ahead.
Nikki Minaj is a celebrated entertainer with roots in Trinidad and Tobago. However, she apparently received bad advice when she appeared at the United Nations just a day or two ago with the U.S. ambassador, where she endorsed the U.S. campaign to go into Nigeria with guns blazing, supposedly because of genocide against Christians. This raised a number of questions. Number one, Trinidad and Tobago, as this audience knows more than most, has been in the forefront of progressive politics, Pan-Africanism, revolutionary politics stretching back to Henry Sylvester Williams and the founding of Pan-Africanism more than a century ago. Of course, he made his way to Abyssinia in his campaign. Not only Henry Sylvester Williams, but C.L.R. James, the author of the still relevant book on the Black Jacobins, which is one of the early texts alluding the profundity of the Haitian Revolution. Eric Williams, of course, founding father, his text, Capitalism, Slavery, still repays attention. The man formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, who made his mark in the United States of America, developing the notion of Black power. And of course, Claudia Jones, the US communist who was deported to London, of all places, not to Trinidad and Tobago, but then she became a leader of the Black British population. But what is also notable about Nicki Minaj's intervention is that I'm worried about its downside consequences in Trinidad itself, not to mention neighboring Guyana, where there are sizable populations of African descent, South Asian descent, with the latter containing a significant number of Muslims. I fear and fret that her intervention could unnecessarily stir up conflict between these two important populations to the detriment of peace and stability. But perhaps even more than that, she should have taken the opportunity to point out that if there is a concern about religious zealotry in Nigeria, the finger of accusation should be pointed at US imperialism, which has collaborated with the Saudis, and of course the Saudis, that is to say the de facto king, MBS Mohammed bin Salman, was paying a visit to the White House as she was making her statement. And we know that the Saudis collaborated with US imperialism in stirring up religious zealotry in Afghanistan, which was a factor leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union by 1991. And we also know that before MBS entered the Oval Office, the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, a man once known as al-Jilani, now al-Shara, had also paid a visit to the White House. And of course, Mr. Al-Zawani in particular is notorious for his anti-Christian pogroms, for example. But here's breaking news that has not received sufficient attention, although I'll be talking about it, I hope, in more detail on the program Around the Horn on Wednesday evening. Just arrested in the United States were a number of Euro-American men planned to invade Gonave, which is part of Haiti, kill all the men, and then enslave the remaining women and children. And I think what this story points up is that if you really are serious about religious extremism and persecution, you should point the finger of accusation initially at U.S. imperialism. And so this was very disappointing on the part of Nikki Minaj. It would not surprise me at all if it would lead to a boycott of her, quote, artistry, unquote. I understand that she may have been trying to seek good wishes and good graces of Mr. Trump with regard to gaining a pardon for someone very close to her, because Mr. Trump is known for dishing out pardons like they're confetti, particularly if the person on the other end of the bargain is willing to cut a deal with him. But this is really disappointing on the part of Nikki Minaj.
Can you remember that C.L.R. James was responsible for Lord Kitchener? I don't know if it became the national anthem, but he did a song called "The Birth of Ghana," and that was arranged by another Trinidadian, C.L.R. James, or Trinidadian C.L.R. James. You can pull the song up on YouTube. A great song by, I guess, one of the greatest calypsonians, Lord Kitchener. I know you know that song, Dr. Horne.
Of course. And that's why I took time to salute Professor James. All
right. Can we talk about the debut of tax finance, glorification of genocide, and mass enslavement of U.S. TV?
Well, I take it you're referring to the multi-part series on 1776, which glides past the fact that despite this notion that 1776 was so grand, at the time of the secession from the British Empire, there were thousands of enslaved Africans. By 1860, there were millions. At the time of the secession, the settlers were stuck on a slim piece of land stretching roughly from Boston to Savannah. By 1860, they had reached the Pacific coast as they had waged war against Mexico and walked away with California. Earlier than that, settlers in Texas seceded from Mexico because they wanted to continue enslaving Africans, despite protestations to the contrary by the government in Mexico under a man of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. What's even more remarkable about this taxpayer financed defamation, not least of Black people, is that many people on the left, even people in Canada, tend to go along with it. I just read the story about this conference in Halifax in Nova Scotia, where Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina says that Canada owes the United States $300 billion. Did you see that story?
Yes, I saw it a few seconds ago, right. I just saw it.
Now, it's grand theft robbery. He's trying to hold up Ottawa, basically. And yet we still have the naive, or perhaps the misbegotten in Canada, perhaps because the ruling elite in Canada has its roots not least in fleeing the United States and fleeing 1776. And I guess people on the left, at least some, feel that if the ruling elite flees 1776, then we should embrace it. what you really should do is recognize that there is an ongoing movement south of the border to re-examine 1776, and you should embrace that new telling or the retelling of that old story. But in any case, it's clear that the romantic version of 1776 is hardly sustainable. And it's not only hardly sustainable, but it's not historical in the sense that we study the past, at least some of us study the past, so that we can gain insight into the present. But the way this story is told is that you had these grand men who walked on water, speaking of the founding fathers in 1776, and they helped to oust Britain and set up this republic, a shining city on the hill. But then the story sort of stops there. There's no further elucidation of genocide against Native Americans, against increase and intensification of enslavement of Africans, for example. And so you don't have any insight as to how we ended up with Trumpism. C. Kwame Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City, has reiterated that he thinks Trump is a fascist. So how did we get from the men who walked on water to a fascist sitting in the Oval Office? These sorts of documentary multi-part series that we're being subjected to, or that some are being subjected to, provide no insight into that. And so it fails a fundamental lesson of history, which is you study the past in order to get insight into the present. I think in the United States, there's a study of the past so that you can invade the present. And so you don't have to deal with the contradictions of the present. And that is the kind of thinking that ultimately will blow up in our faces.
Dr. Horne, I am dying to hear your thoughts on Jacob Zuma stabbing the Western Sahara in the back.
Well, he visited Morocco just a few days ago. Jacob Zuma being the former president of South Africa, who left the ruling African National Congress and formed his own party, the MK Party, the so-called Umkhonto we Sizwe Party. And it's widely suspected that Mr. Zuma, who often carries his begging bowl along with him on foreign trips, also brought it to Morocco because Morocco is in hot water because it seized Western Sahara over the protests of Polisario, the liberation movement there. And it's suspected that he was paid off in order to execute that evil deed. Also keep in mind that a few years ago, in July 2021, as I recall, there was an insurrection in Durban that was spearheaded by Zuma-like forces. And there was also a sort of call for Zulu tribalism or ethnocentrism, which was wholly contrary to the traditions of the African National Congress, and particularly their ally, the South African Communist Party. And targeted, I'm afraid to say, were a number of those of South Asian descent. Of course, it echoes what we just said about Nikki Minaj. And Jacob Zuma is oftentimes carrying his begging bowl because he has multiple wives, children too numerous to count, and that is a breeding ground for corruption. As I've said more than once, one does not have to embrace or even salute his predecessor, speaking of Thabo Mbeki, to recognize and acknowledge that when the ANC leadership executed a palace coup and ousted Mbeki and replaced him with Jacob Zuma, it was one of the most disastrous personnel moves in the history of planet Earth, I would say exceeding what happened in 1944 when the Democratic Party ousted Henry A. Wallace as FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, replaced them with a warmonger, Harry S. Truman, who then went on to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the major mass murders of human history, not to mention spearheading the Red Scare and anti-communism and leading the United States into a disastrous war on the Korean Peninsula from which it is yet to extricate itself. There's still tens of thousands of US troops in South Korea, for example. Even the entry into that conflict by Chinese troops, who gave a real shellacking to the US forces, did not force altogether a US invasion. In fact, Charles Rangel, who served for a number of years as congressman from Harlem in Washington, wrote a really affecting memoir. I haven't had a bad day since. And that title refers to the fact that he was in the midst of that Chinese invasion, that Chinese intervention, I should say, that helped to push back the Yankees. And he thought he was going to die, needless to say. He was able to continue in the land of the living. But in any case, back to Jacob Zuma, I don't think his misdeeds are over yet, because South Africa is under real pressure right now. If we have time, we'll probably talk about the conclusion of the G20 meeting, the Group of 20 meeting in Johannesburg. The United States boycotted that meeting. Although the upside is that the US boycott probably facilitated the smooth operations of that international gathering. The European leadership was there, including Ursula von der Leyen of the EU, and Starmer, Merz, and Macron of the EU. I take it that Mark Carney was there. Can you confirm that?
Yes, he was there.
So the U.S., in many ways, is isolating itself. The next G20 meeting will take place in the United States, I believe in Florida. If I'm not mistaken, it'll be taking place in one of Mr. Trump's properties, of course. Mr. Corruption personified has found a way to benefit himself and his family from these sorts of machinations. And in some ways, one of the reasons I think that Jacob Zuma does not receive more attention is that he is outstripped so soundly by Mr. Trump in terms of lining his own pockets. Mr. Trump has turned corruption into an art form, if you can believe it.
Well, Mr. Carney is, I guess he's trying to play two ends against the middle, because he is trying to distance himself, I guess, above board from Trump. But I think he still has, he's still dealing with Trump. And the Premier of Ontario, Ford, is very critical of. He's critical of Mark Carney and his dealings with Trump.
Well, I'm not sure how Canada can benefit from this relationship between Carney and Trump, because, as I said, the United States imperialism plans to do a holdup in Ottawa. They plan to loot and plunder and pillage Canadian resources. To his credit, Mark Carney, I believe it was in the victory speech he gave a few months ago after he triumphed in the elections, he pointed out that U.S. imperialism wants Canada's water, and not to mention its timber, not to mention its mining interests, for example. And it's unclear if Ottawa has a strategy to repel this kind of brigandage. I know that Ottawa has taken our advice, has tried to improve relations with China, has tried to improve relations with India. It doesn't seem as if it'll try to improve relations with Russia, however, not least because of the presence north of the border of this sizable Eastern European population, oftentimes of Nazi-like sympathies. Recall the Nazi who received standing ovations in Ottawa in the Parliament just some months ago. Of course, Chrystia Freeland, who I understand has had a falling out with Mr. Carney and a challenge to become the next prime minister and the leader of the Liberal Party. She is at the center of that kind of reactionary politics. But in light of the fact that the escapade in Ukraine might be coming to a crashing end, as we speak in Geneva, you see that the United States administration is meeting with the Ukrainian delegation and also a European delegation. Of course, they're just negotiating amongst themselves. I don't understand how they expect to make progress when the real party in interest, speaking of Russia, is not present, but there you have it. And so if this Ukrainian escapade comes to a conclusion, and Mr. Trump has given the Ukrainians until Thursday to accept his so-called peace plan, well, then perhaps that'll pull the rug out from under Chrystia Freeland and her right-wing cabal, although it's unclear, because one of the problems with these negotiations, such as they are, is that there are apparently 2 or 3 different versions of this 28-point peace plan floating around. That is to say, there's a version that was leaked by the Ukrainians. There was a version that ultimately was passed on to Russia. And apparently there's a 3rd version whose provenance is unclear. And so the parties are not necessarily on the same page, but I dare say that one result of a conclusion of this conflict in Ukraine will be that Ukraine will not be joining NATO, that it will have to cede territory to Russia, and it would also be another demerit on the already demerit-stuffed record of Joseph R. Biden, who ignored the advice of his predecessor, speaking of Barack Obama, who counseled against a Ukrainian intervention by U.S. imperialism because he said correctly that Russia has escalatory dominance. And that concept has been proven to be accurate.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne. You have some more questions, Melinda?
Did we talk about Mexico and South America's move to the left?
Well, it's very interesting. First of all, Mr. Trump has threatened to bomb Mexico, for example, because of the alleged complicity of the government there in terms of the drug trade into the United States. But Mr. Trump should be paying more attention to what's going on in this hemisphere. He's not only alienating many Canadians. In Ecuador, there was a vote this past week where the citizenry voted by a hefty margin not to accept U.S. bases. In Chile, and I think we mentioned this last week, presidential election led to a communist emerging with more votes than any other, although there will be a runoff where that result might not be duplicated. We're all very familiar with the attempt to overthrow the regime in Venezuela, although I'm beginning to suspect, like others, that Mr. Trump is engaged in the art of the bluff more so than the art of the deal. He feels that sending aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines to the shores of Venezuela will cause the regime to crack, despite the fact that the regime will receive intensified support from neighboring Colombia, despite the fact that the regime has received arms from Russia and financing from China, despite the fact that Iranian petroleum engineers are helping to make sure that petroleum continues to flow. And of course, the Congress of the People, the COP30, just concluded in Brazil. And once again, the United States boycotted, which probably once again made the course smoother in terms of reaching agreements. But in any case, Mr. Trump is on the back foot with regard to dealings with Brazil. He's been forced to retreat from the high tariffs against Brazilian coffee in particular, because of the affordability crisis in this country, particularly with regard to food prices. And he thought that he would be meeting with Lula da Silva, speaking the Brazilian president, his predecessor, speaking of the Trump of the tropics, Mr. Bolsonaro. But apparently Mr. Bolsonaro was fiddling improperly with his ankle monitor. And so it will be difficult for him to have any sort of face-to-face meeting with Mr. Trump. Perhaps he can arrange a Zoom meeting with Mr. Trump. So signs are pointing in an anti-Trump direction in this hemisphere. And I might also say in an anti-Trump direction in the United States as a whole. I think we recalled, or we mentioned last week, the rift in the GOP, in the U.S. Republican Party, between the Hitler's cool faction and the so-called pro-Zionist faction. That rift is not going away anytime soon. And the pro-Zionist faction has been a major financial supporter of Mr. Trump, but it's unclear if even their financial firepower can match that of the Saudis, who are cutting all manner of deals with Mr. Trump and the Trump organization and his two avaricious sons, Don Jr. and Eric. And so even though we counted Mr. Trump out prematurely before, already I think it's fair to suggest that he's entering the weakened state of being a lame duck. You see that with regard to his erstwhile comrade, a right-wing congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, resigning from Congress, effective in a few days, although she was once more Trumpy than Mr. Trump himself. And so hopefully this is good news for the hemisphere. It's good news for Africa. It's good news for we strugglers in the United States of America.
Dr. Horne, could you talk about the People's Republic of China and and Russia failing to veto the Gaza resolution? That's very important.
It's very important and very controversial. Russia and China have received very severe criticism for not vetoing this proposal put forward by Mr. Trump. And it's understandable because it was basically strengthening the Trump forces in historic Palestine. Of course, Russia and China both issued statements rebuking the resolution that they failed to veto. But I think what happened is that the Arab and Muslim states, including Egypt and Turkey, supported this resolution. The Palestinian Authority supported this resolution. And Russia and China probably felt that they could not be more Catholic than the Pope. But as to say, if the Arab and Muslim powers are supporting this resolution, why should they veto it? But I think the backlash against their failure to veto may forestall such a disaster happening in the future. And in any case, I think it's worthwhile for there to be criticism because we're about to enter a very tricky period of Chinese ascendancy. And as listeners to this program know, that I've been critical of the way China reached this exalted position. And I think it reflects certain kinds of weaknesses, certain kinds of opportunist tendencies within the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think healthy criticism perhaps can be useful in terms of ensuring that that does not happen, at least not frequently. And then there are questions too about Turkey. Russia has a very curious relation with Turkey. Turkey's playing both sides of the fence. It's a member of NATO, and it's a major supporter of Ukraine, drone warfare in particular. And yet it's a backdoor for trade with Russia. And so Russia probably did not want to unduly alienate Turkey. Mr. Erdogan, the leader, has been rather mercurial. As a matter of fact, his major opposition leader is now on trial is facing possibly 2,000 years in prison. I don't know why they had to go to such an extreme there. And so, on the one hand, I think we should try to explain why Russia and China did not veto this ill-advised resolution. But at the same time, we should not spare criticism because it's going to create quite a mess. Now, I think that Russia and China ultimately feel that this resolution will fall because who will disarm Hamas, which is contemplated by this resolution? Who will constitute the stabilization force, the so-called peacekeeping forces, who are bound to come into conflict, perhaps armed conflict with Hamas? And when that happens, of course, it will be catastrophic. So perhaps they're feeling that the Arab and Muslim states should be allowed to clean up this mess once it ensues. But in any case, it is a mess that is ensuing.
And with that, sir, I think we've run out of time.
Good luck to you.
All right. We would like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us on the one as opposed to being like Donald Trump between the 9 and the 10. And we will check you out next week. And Melinda Francis, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I hope all our listeners stay safe through the week, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.